So our theme verse for the year, 1 Timothy 1:15, the saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. This morning I'd like to talk a little bit about why church, though. A lot of people think about the idea of spiritual nature or faith, and you'll even hear people say this sometimes if you try to talk with them about God. That's a personal thing. I don't really, talk about that publicly. That's just, in between me and God. And a lot of people think that way who maybe don't go to church and think, church is just kind of a bunch of man-made up rules. And to some degree, that they're right. Man has created a lot of rules around religion that God didn't. But sometimes people want to have that, I want to have this spiritual nature. I like Jesus' teachings, but I really don't like to be a part of any organized group of people. And basically, I understand that to some degree, but I'm wondering, God wants to save us, so He came to save us, and certainly He could have just saved us individually. He has the power to have talked to us individually, but He chose not to. And so the question I really have, and kind of just the idea of throwing out the purpose of God's church. Why did God build a church for people? And in some respects, we might better say, why did God build a group of people? Because that's really what a church is, just some kind of a group. So why did God make a group rather than just, a bunch of individuals who are saved? And think about, you could look at that question to a great extent, but I want to kind of look at it as real basic form, thinking about what God has told us about building His church and why He did it. Main reason is stated for us in this passage. It's already been read for us, but I'd like to read for us again. Here in Matthew 16, now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, He asked His disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And then He strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that He was the Christ. And so you notice He starts off with some questions. Who does everybody else say that I am? And they're kind of guessing that prophet that Moses spoke of, the promise that Elijah would come again in Malachi, or that maybe you're actually the Messiah. And then He goes on, and they say, "But who do you say that I am?" And they said, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." And He basically uses that moment to talk about building His church. And He says, "It is upon this rock I will build my church." Now, there is a bit of a play on Peter's name, which is Petros, and the word rock, which is Petra. But they are two different words. Many, Roman Catholic Church developed the teaching in the 4th through 6th centuries that Peter was the rock that the church was built on, rather than the statement that he said, and that is, He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Because the word Petra, or rock here, actually means a really mass rock, like a mountain. The word Petros means a rock that could be thrown. It means a stone. Small. So he's a stone that can be thrown. But He's building His church upon the rock, that which He said, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so He tells them, though, that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So that there's this, in this particular statement, there's a sense that hell is essentially almost trying to acquire all of us. And Jesus is going to build up his group so that hell will not win. He's building a group to defeat, might say, Satan, or the end result of Satan and his followers, those who follow the lie rather than the truth. And that's the main reason for the church. And so we think about the church. We don't think about the church saving us, right? We say the church doesn't save us. But God, in his wisdom of saving us through Jesus' blood, has also made us a group. And he did that for a reason. And he states in a number of places his reasons for that. That's kind of what we want to look at today and try to understand that. Why did he make groups of people rather than just, because the group doesn't change the blood, does it? Whatever group I'm a part of, or whether the group's big or small, none of that changes the blood that saves me. But there is some kind of purpose to the group. And so we want to look at that and think about the idea of what is a church. Now, I've talked about this in the past. The word church is an English word, but it actually comes originally from a Greek word that means a place or a building. So like when we argue with people who, a church, is the building. No, a church isn't a building. Well, we're arguing the original Greek word that's translated from doesn't mean building, but the word church does mean building. It actually comes from a Greek word that meant a building, a place. And it really is comes from a phrase that apparently developed in the, I think the 3rd, 4th centuries and things, where they began to build buildings. Some of the earliest buildings known that churches were gathering in, that are kind of recorded in archaeology anyway, were homes. Just like somebody today might take a home and kind of remodel it and have people meet in it. Well, some of the earliest places that they have found were homes that simply had been kind of cleared out and even baptistries put in to, for maybe 50 to 100 people to meet in it. And so they began to refer to the Lord's house. And that's kind of where the term comes from, and then kind of developed into Latin, and then we got Greek, or the English became. And so when the Bible gets translated into English, the tradition of people referring to the building where they all met as the Lord's house was well established, like 1,000 years. And so when it came to the church, they began to use that word, the church, rather than some kind of a group, which is what the language in the Bible doesn't use this phrase. And so the word church is not translating that Greek word. It's translating a different Greek word, which many of us have heard before, ecclesia, which refers to some group or an actual meeting of people. And it doesn't refer to God's people. Now, it kind of came to mean that. It kind of became out of favor to use it for other things, but it kind of became in its use, it became used as in a very Christian way, but it's not what it meant originally. It just meant any kind of group of people. Could refer to any group of people in any particular area, any group of people who were meeting at a particular time, any type of group of people. That's what the word meant. And so when we're talking about building, this is what God's talking about building. Jesus wasn't talking about building cathedrals or buildings. He spoke about saving people from hell, saving a group of people from hell. I'm kind of reminded of this when I have seen students, especially from Asia, they come to America, and the idea that sometimes they want to see a church. And so, we might, we'll invite them to church, right? Well, we're not inviting them to go see a really magnificent building, are we? And they are often thinking that's what they're going to go see. That's their concept, that they're going to go see a church. They don't have many of them in Asia, in certain countries especially. And so the idea of these concepts of these cathedrals, because if you look up church, or if you look up church in on an encyclopedia or online, what's it going to show you? Think big steeples on it, big stained glass windows. I mean, stained glass windows that would cost a fortune to try and make today. And that's what they're expecting to kind of see. They go, in fact, all in Europe, the church attendance across the board is down massively all throughout Europe. Many people who go are tourists. Lots and lots of old cathedrals in Europe simply keep their doors open because tourists want to go see these magnificent buildings. And they are magnificent buildings. The architecture, the engineering, the builders who built them, I mean, a lot of work, a lot of money, a lot of time. But it wasn't really what God was talking about. He was talking about making a group of people that wouldn't be destroyed by hell. And so, think about, though, the question, why do some people hate church? It's probably a complex answers to a lot of that. But you think about, a lot of it has to do with the hypocritical behavior of its followers. We can think about that's been true throughout the ages. People have complained about the behavior of people associated with churches. We can go back all throughout history of Christianity and find lots of periods of times where the church has been renowned for inappropriate actions. And I mean church in a very general way. And now there are times when it also had very good reputation. We see that in the Bible. In Jerusalem they had that. We see that even in history. The Romans had that, of many of the Christian communities that existed in the Roman Empire, especially when they were a persecuted group of people and an outlawed group of religious people. I've heard it said and even thought it myself before I was a Christian. If it wasn't for his people, I could be a Christian. I really like that Christ guy. I like a lot of those things he talks about. But I just can't stand those people. I've seen that written on the internet. I've heard people say that in years past. And like I said, I've thought that even myself. Because I grew up not with religion and not going to church at all, but my father's family was very religious. In fact, most of his family was very upset that my father never went to church anymore. His older 12 siblings, for the most part, all went to church all the time. And the handful of times I actually went to church, I think it's 3 or 4, were because I was staying with an aunt or an uncle. And they took me to church. And they put me in a kids class, and I got candy. That's all I remember from those kids classes. But they wanted me to go. They were trying to get me. And then even in my older siblings, some of them became devout and religious in different ways. And all of them, to some degree, tried to convert me when I was still young. And so I understand and I understood Christians, and I saw my dad's family, and I even saw some, my own family, just kind of looking at my family and go, well, that's what it is. I mean, if that's what Christianity is, something seems wrong. In fact, I told people when I was a new Christian, I'd been a Christian about a year or so, and I even told some of the people in the congregation where I originally was a Christian, I said, I'm not sure I've heard as much gossip since I joined a church. I mean, we like to say, oh, that's one of those things people shouldn't do, but I think a lot of people outside churches they're not that interested in everybody else's life. And my experience has been that Christians sometimes are a little too interested in everybody's life. And so gossip, it's hard to get away from sometimes. Sometimes you're in the middle of it before you realize it's happened. And so, if it wasn't for just those people, well, this isn't new. Jew, by the way, bringing all this up. This didn't start with Jesus or his followers. This is actually was said of the Jews. In the passage in Romans chapter 2 says, if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law and boast in God and know his will and approve what is excellent because you are instructed from the law, and if you are sure that you are yourself a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Don't a lot of Christians kind of think about that of themselves? That's what we are, right? And these were Jews who had the law, and they think we've got the truth from God, and we've got the reality, and all those Gentiles don't know anything, but we're there to help them. Those ignorant, people who just don't do the right thing. And he says, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? He says, while you preach against stealing, do you steal? Was stealing a problem in Israel? It was such a big problem that Jesus, that's really the central thing that was happening when Jesus overturned all the money changers and the tables in the temple. People were ripping their other brethren off, taking advantage of them, knowing they had to travel long distances and couldn't bring all the food or necessary sacrifices. And so they would then sell all those things in the temple. But then they went, well, we can't just use regular, ordinary Roman kind of money to sell stuff, because then people might know what it actually really costs. So no, we've got to have temple money, special temple money. That exchange rates, bankers making money on exchange rates. Who would think it? Well, that's what they were doing. They were cheating and stealing right in God's temple. And that's what made Jesus so mad. And that wasn't new. We look all through the history, for most of the history of Israel, the priests had a problem. They often weren't faithful and weren't doing what God asked them to do. But neither were the people who weren't priests doing what God asked them to do or told them to do. And so, what happened? He says, you who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? So if we look back at Israel, well, adultery didn't exist in their country because they all knew it was wrong. No, because it was people, weren't they? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Kind of reference to Jesus there, I think, and him overthrowing temples, or overthrowing the money changers in the temple. You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. And as he's writing this, it had already been written before. It wasn't anything new. The Gentiles were looking at Jews going, boy, if that's what God's like, he must not be very good. Nothing new. The church has always, God's people have often failed to live up to, and I shouldn't even say how they have often failed. I should say they have always failed to live up to the standard that is Christ, because we're human beings. And I was reminded that when I was, about that same time, I was thinking, man, I don't think I've ever heard so much gossip. I'd been a Christian 6 months to a year, but I was reminded by a brother, he's like, the church is full of people who are sinners. What do you expect of them? You expect them to be perfect? It's like, well, that is kind of what people think of the church. They do expect us to be perfect. And when we're not perfect, they kind of call us out on it. And then the people who are supposed to be perfect in their minds call people out who aren't doing what's right. So you shouldn't be doing that. And say, well, yeah, but you guys shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Who's the hypocrite here? They're not claiming to follow God. We are. Us not walking that walk is a much bigger problem than them not walking that walk. And so, but you kind of, I think once we kind of are aware of that, we kind of become used to the fact, yeah, we're not expecting perfection from the church. But the people outside, they often are. And they use, sometimes it's just an excuse to kind of excuse their own, I don't want to try and follow because they're just a bunch of hypocrites. The truth, they often don't want to do it anyway. But why? The church itself sometimes is the reason God gets a bad name. Always been that way. About the three kinds of groups of God. The Lord's Scriptures speak about groups of Jesus' followers in three distinct ways. And the first, all people who are part of God's household. Hebrews chapter 12, 22 to 23, but you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. He's talking about how, and he's specifically writing probably to Jewish Christians in this book, and telling them, we've come to something different than our forefathers did when they went to Mount Sinai, and God, is speaking out of it, and there was thunder and lightning, and they're scared to death. Well, we haven't come to that. That's not the God we've approached. That's not whom we've joined to. We have come to God and to His spiritual mountain of Zion. Not the literal mountain of Zion, because we're not there. We haven't been there. Christians haven't been there in very many numbers for a very long time. But he says, into the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable angels. So all these angels. So we are in this gathering in Mount Zion, a heavenly Jerusalem, the city of the living God, with all kinds of angels. In festal gathering means it's a feast time. And he says, to the assembly, and that's the word church, ecclesia, of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. Now, Jesus is the firstborn, right? But who is the assembly of the firstborn? The people who are part of that covenant. We become firstborn when we are in Christ. We are the firstborn. Because and think about what the name refers to. If we know our Old Testament, why would we call every single Christian a firstborn? Because we all get the inheritance. We all get the portion. It's not only for one of the siblings. It's been given to every one of us. And so we are the church of the firstborn, those who follow Christ. And it is to all of them, and notice it says to those who are enrolled in heaven. Your name just has to be on the roll, on the book, Revelation talks about. Your name written in the book, that's the group you've become a part of. And that's the one that, in fact, book of Acts talks about, he joins us to, doesn't he? Who writes down our name in the book? No people. God does that. God's the one that says, that's mine. He's the one that identifies us and says, that one's mine. I've got his name right here in my book. He enrolls us in his household. The second part of that are groups of Jesus followers who live in specific places. Now, many of you are probably aware I'm not using the traditional terms that we call these things. And I'm doing that purposely. I don't want to use the traditional terms because we don't need traditional phrases and terms. And one problem that as Christians we have in talking with people who are not Christians is sometimes explaining things in ways they can really easily understand. Because sometimes as Christians, we use Bible language as answers. We know what that phrase means in the Bible, but people who don't know the Bible don't know what it means. Like innumerable angels, in festal gathering. How many of the people you know that don't go to church would have any idea what that means? They might be able to parse it and go look up each word and go figure it out, but they don't know. And they're kind of off the top of their head. They're not used to that phrasing. They're not used to those words. We have all kinds of words that are just Christian words, like church. Even though it wasn't originally a Christian word, it was just a word describing what God was doing. And so a lot of times, I think if we can use words and descriptions that don't fall back into the traditional word, the church words, I think we will help bridge the conversation with people who are not Christians. To talk about things in ways without using church speech. And so you got a group of followers who live in specific places, and 1 Corinthians talks about he's writing a letter. And this, by the way, wasn't some official letter with a right title in it. He wrote a letter, a personal letter, to a group of God's people who lived in Corinth. And that's how he addressed it to the church, that group of God who are in Corinth. And that's how he wrote it out. Like you and I would write, "Dear so-and-so." That's what he wrote. Really fairly simple, innocuous phrase referring to a bunch of Christians who lived in Corinth. In Romans, he talked about, he was writing to that church there, and at the very end of it, he talks about greeting one another with a holy kiss, and he says, all the churches of Christ, so all these groups that are Christ's, are greeting you. So he's sending greetings from a bunch of groups of Christians that he has met. Now, when he wrote the book of Romans, if you kind of can picture in your mind where he was when he did that, he's probably in Corinth. He's wrapping up the collection that he's going to take to Jerusalem. Because of the needs that were there for the poverty. And so as he's finishing it up in Corinth, he has been through a whole bunch of churches picking up money in a very short period of time. So when he's talking about all these churches are greeting you, he's probably specifically referring to all the ones he's just been at. And he's probably talked about the fact that he is planning on finishing this up and going to Rome. And they're like, well, send them our greetings. Don't you do that with friends? You talk to somebody you haven't talked with in a long time, and you say, oh, tell your wife hi for me. That's what they were doing. All these different groups were sending their greetings to the Christians in Rome. But the third way it's used is actually a group of Jesus' followers who have gathered together in a specific place at a specific time. I probably should add that. All together in one place. So let's look at a couple of paths. 1 Corinthians 11:18. For in the first place, when you come together as a church. Well, weren't they already the church in Corinth before they actually gathered? Yeah, he refers to a bunch of group of people who are Christians and lived in Corinth. That's the way he was using the word, but now he's using the word when they actually had come together in one place to have, and in this particular passage, do you remember why they were doing that? This is that one that we always read from a lot of times on Sunday. Because he wasn't commending them. They were coming together to take the Lord's Supper in chapter 11. But this is church. We are in church. What in church means, though, and that is it. So that is kind of a biblically sound phrase. It doesn't mean in the building. It means in a gathering. That's what being in church means. And then, 1 Corinthians 14 says, but if there is no one to interpret, let them keep silent in church. Man, could you imagine that? Having to go like a whole week till the next meeting, see if somebody showed up. Okay, I can't talk for the next week. I'm thinking some of the guys might like that. But it's not what he's saying, is it? He simply was saying if you had the ability, and he's specifically talking there about having the ability to speak in tongues. So if you knew you had the ability to speak in other languages, God's message, but if there wasn't somebody there who could interpret that language, who had that gift as well, then you weren't to do it in the meeting. Didn't mean you couldn't talk otherwise. It actually wasn't even referring to the fact that you couldn't talk in their normal language in the meeting. It simply is telling you not to actually use that gift of speaking in tongues. But only in that meeting is what he's referring. Why come together in church? What's really the purpose? The problem of much, churches, in fact, I was thinking about it. I have a number of siblings, and my first probably experience of, my first experience of church was probably Catholicism. I had a few older siblings who were Catholic, had gone through their catechism, and did, the whole process, and were Catholic, Roman Catholics, and so I was kind of somewhat familiar with that. They went from time to time, my older siblings, and but in a Catholic church, when people show up, it's a lot like when people want to come to a church and kind of come in at last moment, sit in the back row, and then head right out, right? Just like the whistle blows. That's what going to church was like. They're like, I'm not there to talk to anybody. I'm there to kind of do my deed. I've got to put my penance in. I put my time in this week. Okay, God, I did my thing, and I'm heading out here to go do my stuff. That's kind of how people think. That's what I saw. That's what I thought people did. It's like, well, that's why you went to church. You have to put in your time. And it really misses the point, doesn't it? When we study the Scriptures, when we learn more and grow in it, we realize that's not really why He wanted us to gather, just so that everybody says, hey, I put in my hour. You would have been hoping you weren't a Christian when Paul was talking, because putting in an hour wouldn't have been enough. So, what is the purpose? 1 Corinthians 11:17. In the following instruction, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. Now, that's how we started off. The next verse was the one I talked about, used on the previous slide. But I just want to focus on, he's not commending them. That is a Greek phrase of saying, I'm condemning you. Okay? Well, I'm not going to say anything bad about you. What does that mean? Or I can't say anything good. It's kind of a way of saying I've got something bad, but I'm not going to really say it. And that's what he is saying. He's actually using, Greeks, I guess, had a way of doing this from what I've read, that they would say, that's not little, and what they meant was, that was huge. That's not a little thing, big thing. And so he's saying, I'm not going to commend you. He's condemning them. He's reprimanding them for their behavior when they were coming together. And he goes on, and the chapter, most of the rest of the chapter is about that. But he says what was happening is they weren't coming together for the betterment of people. It was worse. They were worse off having come together. And so think about that for just a moment. Should we really be surprised that some people gather in churches and feel like they don't want to come back? Could you imagine some of the people here who didn't have anything, who came and gathered, who didn't have any fruit of the vine, who didn't have any unleavened bread, and others wouldn't share, and their group had already taken theirs and they didn't have any and didn't give any to you? Do you think some of the people there felt like, this isn't really helping? I'd rather not be here. I'm guessing probably was in Corinth. Now, they felt like they were supposed to, and they probably went because they knew they were supposed to. But it's not just because they're supposed to, but because he wants us to do it, but he wants us to do it in a way that is making people better, encouraging them, building them up. 1 Corinthians 14:26. What then, brothers, when you come together? So from 11 all the way through chapter 13, he's talking about love, and he's talking about all the fruits of the Spirit, and 12 and things. In chapter 14, he comes back to the idea of when we come together, what really are we trying to do? They've been messing it up in a lot of ways. But he says, so when you come together, some people had a hymn, had a lesson, some people had a revelation, some people had a tongue, some people had an interpretation. Every single thing he said, no matter what it was there to build people up. And I thought yesterday how ironic this is. We argue that the word church doesn't mean a building, though it really does. And then the language used is to edify, which means, you know what it means to edify? To put things up on a structure and build the edifice. You know, we go by, there's all kinds of places in the valley, right? You can go by, and right now somebody has scraped the land. And somebody came up behind them and dug a bunch of trenches. And then somebody came behind them and poured a bunch of concrete in those trenches. And then some framer came along and started putting up 2x4s on it, or 2x6s. They're building an edifice. And actually what the phrase to build up one another means. We need to build ourselves upon the foundation that is Christ and the apostles. And there are places in Scripture that talk about that idea. That's what we're trying to do. When we come together, it is for the purpose of strengthening ourselves, building something up in ourselves. That's why God asked us to come together. 1 Corinthians 14:37, if anyone thinks he's a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I am writing to you are a command of the Lord. And so the Lord, Paul tells them, he's like, yeah, I'm writing them to you, but you have to understand, if you really are somebody who wants to listen to God, you've got to understand what I'm writing to you are the Lord's commandments. So he's telling us to get together, but he's telling us to come together to better one another, to encourage one another, to build each other up, to help us keep going, to help us not lose to the gates of hell. That's our purpose. To not lose people, to encourage one another. Just like children, right? God doesn't send babies into the world like he does other animals, right? Human babies, people, when you talk about biologists, they have how long does it take human babies to be on their own? A lot longer than it does for any other animal, right? A lot longer. And not just to be able to take care of themselves, for you to send them out. How quickly are the birds sending them out? How quickly are most animals sending them out? Some keep them around a little while, a year, 2 years, and they're out. Humans aren't like that. The church isn't like that. Babes come into the church, and we need the older brethren to help them out, just like we do in families. That's why the groups, in fact, in Scriptures are called families by God. Very often. God is building a family. That's the group that He is making. So let's just consider this kind of as we wind up here. Jesus is building His church to save us from hell. That's why He's doing it. It consists of imperfect and sometimes hypocritical people. We call them sinners, of which all of us are. Our need for Christ's grace is universal. It applies to me, it applies to you, it applies to the neighbors next door, it applies to everybody sitting in their house this morning who don't think about God. Their need for grace is exactly the same as yours and mine. And our need to build each other up is why Jesus told us to come together. We're not solitary animals. Now, He didn't maybe put us in our little packs, right? But you might say families are in a certain way. We grow up in certain kind of groups, and then we go out and we kind of start making our own groups. And we do that whether we have physical children or not. Most everybody forms groups of friends, groups, some group that we connect to. How many groups are you connected to on social media? Especially if you're young, I bet you got a bunch of different groups you're connected to. So, people who like to wear red shoes on, Tuesday. We do. Why do we want to gather like that? Why do we want to take up a collection of people who all have that same kind of thing we like to do? Because we are group people. We are made to be in groups. We need that encouragement, we need that support, and that's what we have in the church. And we need to do that to come together. And so we know that when people stop coming together with us, there's a problem, isn't there? That's why we need to be there. And it's not because we gather just for ourselves, because as we grow up, we may not gather as much for us, though I would argue with somebody who thinks we don't still get something out of it, regardless of how mature we are. But even when we are more mature, then we got to be there for the others. We might start off coming to church needing everything being, said and taught. But later on, we might be the people needing to encourage and teach others. Be there for everybody else. And don't let the weakness of people stop you from Jesus' salvation. That's the point that, to make. I remember I had a conversation with a young lady like 20-some years ago. Now, but I remember it was burned in my head because she was setting me up in a phone conversation. I was actually calling for a church thing. I was trying to order something for the church and had this long conversation with the lady I was ordering. She was we were having this conversation. I could kind of tell she was like setting me up, with a butt. Well, apparently she had been a Catholic, and her dad, but her dad had been sexually abusing her all through childhood. All those years they went to church, her dad had been sexually abusing her. So she, at some point came along, and I'm talking about God, and why I believe in God, and why I go to church, and why. And then she kind of, threw the hammer down on me, talking about how bad your God is. And we talked a lot about it and kept going on. And I said, my reaction, I guess, probably stumped her a little bit. I said, I'm so sorry about that. But do you think God actually wants that? Teach that? How could he allow it to go on? Well, a lot of bad things go on in the world. I don't know why God allows stuff to happen. And then we went on and said, so I kept going, and she kind of agreed, well, God's, this all good, all loving. So I said, we kind of came to a conclusion. I said, so you're going to reject the goodness and loving kindness of God because of the evil people have done. I said, I don't think that's a good exchange. I think that hurts you more than helps you. And actually, I never got to see her, which I don't know if she was in our town or not, but had some effect. At least she kind of made her think a little that her anger, her bitterness, which I think all of us could understand. But that's exactly what was happening. People sometimes get bitter because of what people have done, what Christians have done. But sometimes that gets in the way. So if you run into those people and talk to those people, don't be surprised when they're kind of like, hey, but these people who are Christians did this and that. And, or maybe they go, look at what they did in the Middle Ages. We shouldn't try and excuse the wrong behavior of lots of Christians throughout time, or lots of God's people throughout time. We just need to talk about that's why we need the love and salvation of God. That's why we need his mercy, why we need his grace, is because of that very fact that we are all sinners who are the foremost, I would suspect, in our own minds.